Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to The Reckoning. Annually on February 7th is the National Black HIV Awareness Day. According to HIV.gov, quote, this observance is a day to acknowledge how HIV disproportionately affects Black people, unquote. The 2024 theme is Engage, Educate, Empower, uniting to end HIV in Black communities. Joining me today is The Reckoning's senior editor, Dr. Deion Hawkins. Dr. Hawkins has written a new article for The Reckoning discussing his journey to HIV advocacy. The article, Different Year, Same Advocate, reflecting on 10 years of HIV research and advocacy, is out now. Deion Hawkins, welcome back to The Reckoning Online. How are you?
Good morning. I am good. How are you?
I am really well. Thank you so much for once again joining us for this conversation. Of course, we are celebrating National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. And you wrote this really, I think, heartfelt and impactful piece about your journey to HIV advocacy. And one of the things that I really connected with, so in your article, you talk about your advocacy in elementary school. And I often talk about, specifically as it relates to my HIV advocacy, in third grade, so this is like 1985, and I was assigned, like, I had to read a newspaper. You know how back then, as kids, you have to learn how to do something, right? So my thing was to read the newspaper and pick an article, and then I had to talk about it. And the article that I selected was about the HIV epidemic at the time. And because I was so struck by it was the amount of death I specifically remember just reading about in this article. And I was like, oh my goodness, what is this thing? And I'm a little kid. So, and it started me down this path of using music was my entry point, but it really started when I was in elementary school and reading this article in 1985. You talk about an experience in elementary school. And what's so funny about it is you were like, listen, you were advocating for folks with disabilities, and you were like, your teacher was not pleased, but your parents were really proud of you, right? Can you talk a bit about that experience and how, if in any way, those early experiences kind of shaped your HIV advocacy today?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation because as I was writing the article, I was like, it's been a while since you kind of reflected over all of this. And so I would say my advocacy skills and my kind of baseline personality has been pretty much the same, and then it was reinforced throughout life. So in particular, if we go back to some middle school, so I grew up Black and gay in Indiana, and so I always stood out. But from a very early age, my parents instilled in me confidence and also standing up for what you believe in, even if other people have decided that that's not what they believe in. And so in throughout school, if I would see an injustice, right? So I remember that at the time they were called special education students. Now we would say either students with disabilities or disabled students. They weren't allowed to participate in recess, and I just could not fathom why that was a fair argument or why that was just accepted, and everyone else was just okay with it. And I could not get an answer to my question as to why. And my teacher was not thrilled when I would push back. And they called my parents, and my parents were like, yeah, we don't really see a issue here. So we're not going to reprimand our son. And for me, from a very early age, if I saw an injustice and if I couldn't get an explanation or a rationale as to something, I would always push back. And this included parents, this included family. And I would really give credit to my parents and my family, because from a very early age, they supported self-advocacy, even if it was against them. And my dad always said, never be afraid to ask a question. And my mom has always said, people will likely have an opinion on you regardless. you might as well give standing your truth, and you might as well advocate for some things and give them a reason to have an opinion about that.
Mm. One of the things, in your background and that you talk a bit about here is you have an extensive background in debate. How did you even discover debate as something that you can one do and something that you excelled at?
So that is a great question, directly tied to my first answer, actually. So I've always been inquisitive, always been naturally combative, but in the most nice way early on. Then teenage years, I think I got a little more combative. And from my parents' perspective, it was a one, it was, I wasn't sure it was annoying, but two, it was also like, well, this is clearly a skill. Right. So I
Mm.
loved reading. I loved learning. I loved getting into intellectual and complex discussions and conversations. And so, when I entered middle school, there was an opportunities to take various electives, and one of the electives that I could take was called Current Issues and Events and Debate. And from then in middle school, I fell in love with it. And then once I transitioned to high school, I found traditional debate where I could learn congressional debate. I learned policy debate, and so I learned to bridge the gap between debate and HIV advocacy early, and the debate skills really were harnessed kind of younger years. And then the aha moment of how I could turn this into greater good social change in the public health sector came during graduate school.
Absolutely. So let's talk a bit about graduate school. So you talk about this moment at 23 where you took this health communications class and you had read that quote, um, 1 in 4 young black gay men will acquire HIV by the age of 25. And you had a moment where you were like, wait, what? I'm 23, right? Can you talk a bit about that moment and how you felt and worked through it during that period when you learned that statistic?
Another great question. So my background before I got into HIV was in education. So I went to undergrad to be a high school English teacher, and that was what I wanted to do. That's what I love to do, and I wanted to do that because there was a huge void of Black male representation and Black male visibility in education. Also,
Mm.
simultaneously knowing that often Black men are left or relegated to the shadows in education. And so when I had my epiphany moment in graduate school, it was because I was recruited to coach debate and ended up in the communication department. And I said, okay, let's take some classes and health communication. We had to pick a health disparity. And naturally, I went to research health disparities in Black gay men. At that time, at 23 years old, I was not at all aware to the state and scope of HIV. And so when I stumbled upon that statistic and I was in my early 20s, that 1 in 4 was mind blowing to me, both from a statistical perspective, because a 25% chance or 25% incidence or prevalence of anything in any demographic is a very high number in public health. But also, it was one of the first aha moments that something that was in a study or something that was research became personal, right? And
Mm.
so it wasn't just this abstract thing that I'm learning about that I'm studying anymore. It was this is a tangible thing that is likely does impact people in your circle that you don't know about or will impact someone in your circle. And the last thing for me is the 1 in 4 number. I remember just being so mind blown, but also dumbfounded by that there not being more attention, more resources, more red flags, alarm bells. And yeah, that was really my kind of aha moment. It was both a stark, I think I was naive, to be honest. I was very naive until that moment. And it was one of those moments that research kind of blew the lid off of it, injustice, and that injustice became incredibly personal because of the network and my social circle, that sort of thing.
Mm. You know what? I'm curious, you know, because I remember the 1 in 4 number. And then, of course, we got to, the 6 or 7 years ago when it was the 1 in 2 Black, gay, or bisexual men will acquire HIV in their lifetime if we do nothing, right? We move to this 1 in 2 number. What, how did that impact you? So you had this 1 in 4 experience, and then we're like, wait, now 1 in 2. What did that do for you?
Oof, that is a great question. So, two-part answer. So, if we say 1 in 4 and then go to the 1 in 2 first, it was a very sobering reminder of the fact that much of the research of the networks that I had, of the kind of groundwork that I saw people doing, was not always translating to kind of large scale success. And I think that when you're doing HIV advocacy work is really difficult to see the progress. And so it's important to keep realistic expectations in mind and also remember why you're doing the work. I think the second thing for me though is that it reinforced the importance of the work in the fact that it is mostly structural and systemic. And so every time I have these conversations with people, I like to start off by saying there's very little, if any, research that indicates that the levels of high HIV acquisition is due to reckless intercourse, things like this. And for the early 2000s, the early 2010s, that was a huge myth that drastically hindered access to things for the Black gay community and also programming. And so for me, it's that 1 in 2. I think we should keep saying it, but as we say it, say that 1 in 2 is due to structural and systemic factors. It is not due to Black gay men deciding to not be engaged in care or not desiring to care about their health. Um, and for me, I also like to tell people, especially on days like February 7th, is that's the kind of day for us to really show that 1 in 2 figure. Because again, if we think about a stark health disparity, even at the global level, right? Like if we were to go to an international context, if we were to see a 1 in 2 figure at an international context, we would likely give hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in some form of support. And so I would like for that sort of engagement or intentionality to also be put towards Black gay men rates of HIV.
Thank you so much for that context and that important reminder. In addition, you also highlight, and I'm going to read this quote because you write that one of the things that was important to you as you were kind of doing your research into the why, right? And one of the things you say is, quote, most people writing and studying Black queer men were not Black queer men, right? Can you talk about specifically that importance of Black queer men, one, pursuing research and writing about Black queer experience, particularly HIV, from your perspective? Why is that really important for us to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to take a step back first and just acknowledge that there's multiple types of expertise, right? And we frequently only value education as knowledge or education as expertise, but lived experience or personal experience attached to something is in itself a form of education, a form of knowledge, right? And so for me, it's important that we have Black gay men that are involved in the process in whatever way that looks like, because inevitably my lived experience with something is going to give it a different content, a different context, a different tone, different takeaways. And so it's just, for me, it's recognizing that sometimes you cannot take away from what lived experience or cultural anchors can give to a study, can give to takeaways. I also say that it's important because if you do the research for the wrong reasons, if you follow the grant dollars, for example, or if you follow the thing that's being studied or funded, you really may be funding or you may be studying something for 5 years and then choosing to leave that community or though that in dust or in turmoil. And that for me, I find to be an anti-ethical and unethical research practice. And so I also just believe that Black gay men are important in the process because I find it immoral and unethical to constantly make judgments, conclusions, takeaways about a population without having that population involved in the process or consulted in the process. And you will frequently have $1 million study from large entities, from study ideation to study, rollout, and evaluation, be all about Black gay men, but rarely have a single Black gay man anywhere in the research protocol. And I just, even if we yield good results, my argument and belief is we would yield better and more impactful and more community centered results if more Black gay men were involved in the process across the stage.
Mm. Thank you so much for that call to action. One, to those institutions and the funding, in addition for encouraging us to make that pursuit. I think this is really important work. My final question for you, to that point, what advice would you give to folks, young and old, who are interested in becoming advocates, particularly in the field of HIV and public health? What advice would you share with them?
Mm, great question. So, my advice for anyone who wants to get involved in advocacy or in HIV advocacy or advocacy overall is two things. First is remember that your advocacy can look like how you want it to look, right? So for me, I have a background in debate. I have a background in advocacy and speaking. And so this type of thing is what I'm comfortable with doing. Leading research, giving people technical assistance, workshops. That is my skill set. If you were to ask me to create a piece of art that represents the HIV movement, it would be terrible. It would be a hot mess. And so I tell people, your advocacy doesn't have to look like the way someone else's, right? So you may not be a public speaker, right? Maybe you're an artist. Maybe you do a different type of research. Maybe you work in HR, right? Maybe you work in healthcare overall. And so for me, I just look at where is your pocket, right? Where is your area of influence, number one, right? And then what is your background and your skill set or expertise that you have? How can you bridge the gap in between those things? And just give yourself grace whenever it comes to advocacy, because often when we're doing advocacy, we are trying to overcome deep, entrenched systemic and structural issues. And we are often doing it at the grassroots or individual or community level. And it always seems like an uphill climb, and it always seems like an impossible kind of mountain to overcome. But if you think about, again, the progress, and you think about what skill set you have and how you can apply it to various stages across HIV, I think that's the key. And just remember, anyone can do it. It's just what works for you, and don't compare yourself to others, because as one of my mentors always says, comparison is the thief of joy. And so, yeah.
Mm. Dr. Deion Hawkins, thank you so much for writing this heartfelt piece on National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, and for the passion and the work that you do. I think it's incredibly important. And I have learned so much from you just in the short time that we've had the opportunity to work together. And I'm incredibly grateful. But your piece, Different Years, Same Advocate, reflecting on 10 years of HIV research and advocacy, is available on The Reckoning online. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you to the CMP family. Until next time.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.